Well, let's go ahead. This is one of the things that's challenging about these webinars. I much prefer to be in person with an audience so that I can kind of gauge whether or not you actually see what I think you're supposed to be seeing. But you know, strange times, we deal with them. And it is my pleasure to be with you. I'm glad that this all worked out, and I hope that it looks like an awful lot of the audience is relatively familiar with vernal pools, at least have visited some, so that's great. And hopefully I can show you a few things that you weren't aware of, and maybe give you some reason to go back to a vernal pool and hunt around and see what you can't find. I love the approach that CREA takes with getting kids out with a net and getting their hands dirty. That's how I started. You know, just a little bit by way of background, if this works. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thankfully I've figured out a way to play with frogs for a living. That's a little bit of a stretch, but not entirely. I started out sort of fresh out of undergraduate school some years back, working for the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, the non-game section, doing environmental review and rare species surveys. But my primary responsibility was dealing with vernal pools. And in Massachusetts, we have a program to officially register vernal pools. We call it certification. And so that was my thing. And so I did an awful lot of work with vernal pools. And I've been able to, you know, in the course of my time with the Natural Heritage Program, I co-authored a field guide to the animals of vernal pools. I think we've distributed something like 30,000 copies of this book over the last 20 years now. It's been very popular up and down the East Coast and into Canada and down to Virginia and out to Michigan and Wisconsin. This ecosystem, these things we call vernal pools, are fairly similar across the glaciated Northeast and even beyond that. And so there's an awful lot of opportunity wherever we go to go out and play with vernal pools. It's a wonderful thing to do. The other thing that I did that I may talk a little bit about if we have time is an aerial photo survey of things that look like vernal pools from the air that we call potential vernal pools. And we have a GIS database of tens of thousands of habitats that look like they're pretty likely vernal pools from the air. And we use that across Massachusetts in regulatory settings and to try to do protection for vernal pools. That's pretty effective in an area where we're dominated by deciduous leaves. It becomes a little less effective when we get up into areas dominated by conifers, but it's an interesting tool that is available these days for finding things and you know, sort of a way to engage with this resource and look for it remotely and see if you can find places that you might like to go look. So recently, this year, I started working with an outfit called the BSC Group. We're an interdisciplinary consulting firm, been around for a long time. We do engineering and land surveying and landscape architecture planning, and I'm part of the ecological services group. And it's pretty exciting to be part of this place and to start thinking about ways in which I can bring my expertise and interests and values to a company that's got a good ethic and is working hard to you know, to do what we can with climate resiliency and management of ecosystems and so forth. So, you know, and we're primarily based out of southern New England, but, you know, we're doing some work in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. So if there's anything that anyone is ever interested in chatting with me about, you know, BSC services, I'm happy to talk about that stuff, of course. And then finally, in terms of my background, a few years back, I initiated, along with some colleagues, a group called the Vernal Pool Association. And we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's got a mission of promoting the study, appreciation, and protection of vernal pools. And we do that primarily these days, because we're all pretty busy. We do that by distributing educational materials, and we're particularly fond of providing high quality photographs of vernal pools and the organisms that we find in vernal pools to organizations and schools and anyone that's trying to promote the study of vernal pools. So, you know, going forward, if there's anything the Vernal Pool Association can do for your community, we're happy to see what we can do to help. Anyway, with that, let's wade into vernal pools. For, you know, when I have to boil down to a sort of a single sentence, what are vernal pools? I like to think of them as small forest ponds that tend to dry up. Now, vernal pools aren't all small. They don't all occur in forest, and they don't all dry up. But it's a pretty good generalization to get people thinking about what we're talking about. So small forest ponds that tend to dry up in the later part of the year. Now, they run the gamut, and I'll show you a whole bunch of photographs of different kinds of things that I think of as vernal pools a little later on, but that's a good starting place. So vernal, of course, means spring. And in California, where the term actually originated, vernal pools fill with spring rain. It's a Mediterranean climate, and sort of February and March rains fill these pools that hold water temporarily. In the Northeast, we stole that term in the sort of middle 1980s, and most of our vernal pools, certainly not all, but a lot, fill up in the fall. And so they're more technically autumnal pools. A good way to find vernal pools that you might look at in the springtime is to go out in the winter and look for nice little skating ponds in the woods. Vernal pools will hold water often. If they fill in the fall, they'll hold water through the winter. Come springtime, they are sort of at their maximum water levels, and they're holding as much water as they're going to hold for that particular year. They're highly variable. So some years, like in this photograph, this pool is very low water, and it just happens that this is a low water year, a droughty kind of year. Sometimes, if it's been real wet, this will be a very deep pool. So there's a lot of variance in that regard. But for the most part, come spring, vernal pools are at their fullest. Then sometime during the year, late summer, early fall, maybe every 2 or 3 or 5 years, a vernal pool will dry out. And what makes this is actually the dynamic that makes vernal pools so important and special. We have an aquatic ecosystem that cannot support fish, and so there's a whole host of organisms that have become adapted to these aquatic ecosystems, but that are intolerant of fish predation. And in the Northeast, there are a handful of organisms that we consider, we generally talk about them as vernal pool obligate species. They require vernal pools in order to successfully breed. This includes the mole salamanders, which are the spotted salamander and blue spotted salamander. And the blue spotted salamander is a wonky animal that has some really kind of interesting genetics. There's a blue spotted salamander. And the one on the image on the right is actually a hybrid of the blue spotted and Jefferson salamander, and that's where the genetics get all funny. But these are mole salamanders. These are all related. They're in the genus Ambystoma. They live underground. They're terrestrial. They're fairly long-lived animals. And they use vernal pools exclusively to breed. Then we have another obligate amphibian called the wood frog. very common frog. In fact, it has the farthest north distribution of any frog in the continental United States. It goes up into the Yukon and up into Canada, right to the toe of glaciers. It's a very widespread frog, but it's a vernal pool obligate species. And then finally, we have a whole host of invertebrates, and I'm going to show you a bunch tonight, which I really love. I really get a charge out of aquatic macroinvertebrates. Some of them are uniquely adapted to vernal pools, and the one I'm showing is a fairy shrimp. These are really wonderful little creatures that require the wet and dry cycle of a vernal pool in order to successfully breed, and I'll explain that a little farther. So on to what I love to think of as the bald eagle of vernal pools. This is the spotted salamander. It's just a wonderful creature to encounter. They are kind of chubby, and they're 6 to 8 inches long. They've got these remarkably bright yellow spots, sort of this perpetual smile on its rubbery face. They're just a lot of fun to encounter and think about what they're doing out in the world. Spotted salamanders, along with all the animals that are uniquely adapted to vernal pools, the obligate species, and some others, get going very, very early in the spring. This is an adaptation to habitat that they essentially know is going to dry out. They have evolved a habit of getting started immediately as soon as we get sort of warm spring rain, when the air temperature reaches about 40 degrees, we get heavy rain at night. Quite often, the vernal pools that they're going to walk down to, they're going to migrate to, are still entirely covered in ice. They might have just a little bit of free water at the edge that they get into. Quite often, they're going to cross patches of snow and ice on their migratory route to get to their vernal pool. But they are reacting to the reliance on a habitat they know is going to dry out, and that they're going to race against that drying to get their larvae out through to the point of metamorphosis. So they go as early as possible, which is pretty amazing if you think about a cold-blooded animal that can that's that size, 7 or 8 inches long, that can go out and hike a long way and temperatures that are 40 degrees and crossing snow. It's a remarkable feat. Now, we've done a pretty good job of crisscrossing the world with pavement, unfortunately. And for a lot of these animals, what it means is that when they're coming from their terrestrial non-breeding habitat up in the woods to hike down to their vernal pool in the early spring, they have to cross a road. And this is actually one of the best ways to encounter these guys is if you wait for that perfect night where it's raining fairly heavily, but the wind's not really blowing. The temperature is just crossing the 40-degree mark, 42 degrees, and it's nighttime. Go out and look for salamanders and frogs. They will be out. And that's one of the best opportunities that we have to encounter these guys. Otherwise, they live underground and they're very seldom seen. The animals are hiking down to the vernal pools to breed. That is their sole purpose. And I'm showing you a video clip of what we term a congress. This can be quite remarkable. You know, there can be sometimes hundreds of individual spotted salamanders breeding together and doing these ritualized mating dances. And it's a remarkable phenomenon to experience. And it's something that brings people out in droves. And it's something that is one of the reasons, you know, a lot of times we have to answer the question, why are vernal pools so important? You know, why should we care? Why should we worry about them? And it's this phenomenon of the early spring migration and breeding congresses and the deposition of eggs. This is really engaging and is something that I think everyone should have the opportunity to go see some at some point. It's really something to get out on a cold, rainy night with your slicker on and your flashlight and a group of people, and you're hunting out through the, traipsing out through the woods to find a pond. It's really an experience. I highly recommend it. After congressing, the males deposit a small packet of sperm on the pool floor, and females will pick up that spermatophore, the sperm packet, in the cloaca. And then after a day or two, they will begin to deposit egg masses. And so this is a really remarkable photograph a friend of mine took underwater of a spotted salamander depositing an egg. Each female is responsible for a single egg mass, and it can have anywhere from 20 to 100, 120 or so individual eggs in the mass, in the group that is makes up the egg mass. So in this photograph, you can see fairly well the individual ova that make up the egg mass, and then there's an outer firm sort of set jello. If you pick one of these up and hold it out of the water and you can jiggle it around, it feels like you made jello. And that's that's a typical spotted salamander egg mass. They can be clear and you can see right through and see the embryos. They can be milky white like the egg mass that's in the foreground of this photograph. And they can be so milky that they look completely like milk glass. And it's just there's a protein difference in some of the females, and it's no big deal. It doesn't affect their viability or anything like that. Spotted salamanders will tend to lay their eggs communally. They'll generally put them in the same location. They find that the population over time discovers the sweet spot and puts all the egg masses there. That's really true of wood frogs, a little less true of spotted salamanders, but still, it's again a generalization that kind of holds. With a little practice and seeing a few, it's not terribly difficult to distinguish between the different egg masses of the different mole salamanders. So in this photograph, there's a spotted salamander egg mass in the center, flanked by two blue spot Jefferson salamander hybrid egg masses. And once you're out in the field and you experience them a little bit, you can tell pretty easily between the different species. Over time, so these eggs develop over the course of about 6 to 8 weeks, depending on conditions, water temperature, the amount of sun over the course of that period of time, position of the egg, and all that. They'll begin hatching out after 6 or 8 weeks, but during their development, they turn green. There's a symbiotic alga that grows inside the egg envelope, and that alga feeds the salamander with oxygen, and it consumes some of the nitrogenous wastes that the embryo is producing. So it's a really remarkable relationship. And what we're discovering, and I don't understand this entirely yet, but the genes for that alga are actually carried by the salamander, the adult salamander. So in a sense, spotted salamanders and some of these other amphibians that do this are photosynthetic. You need to think about that. After they complete their development inside the egg, they hatch out. Salamander larvae are quite distinctive. You're not going to mistake them for pretty much anything else in a vernal pool. Right away, right after hatching, within a day or two, they have all 4 legs. They have a big wide head, big obvious eyes on the sides, and these brushy gills that poke out on the sides of both sides of the head. A long tail that has a well-developed fin. And throughout their development, you're not going to confuse them with just about anything else that you might encounter in a vernal pool. These guys, develop over the course of a couple of months, again, depending on conditions in the pool and whether there's good food resources and whether there's a lot of predators, and all these things play into how long development takes and whether water is sticking around or starting to disappear. And then so after a period of development, if they're lucky enough to reach metamorphosis, they begin to absorb the gills, the external gills, become lung-breathing animals. The tail changes and they become terrestrial amphibians. They will hike off from their vernal pool starting in August, September, October, go out and start their lives, and by the second or third year, they're usually beginning to come back to the vernal pool for their first experience of breeding. Now, again, back to this question of so what? Why should we care about vernal pools, or why should we care about salamanders? One of the things that I have experienced, and this is anecdotal, I'll admit, but you know, in vernal pools that have a nice, robust population of amphibians in them, the mosquitoes don't tend to be all that bad. You know, sure, they're there, but it's not the stinking mosquito ditch of a pool that has been affected and doesn't have any amphibians anymore. Salamanders and other predators that we'll find in vernal pools are really important predators of mosquito larvae. It's one of the primary food sources for salamanders. So they're real valuable in just sort of making our lives more comfortable. Now, within vernal pools, there's just an awful lot of interesting stuff from a biologist's standpoint to explore. Coloration is one sort of simple, obvious thing to look at. The coloration of a spotted salamander is highly unique, and it can be used much like a fingerprint. I have some folks that have been photographing salamanders in a sort of standardized way over many years, and have been able to document that one individual salamander keeps coming back for the last 15 years based on a spot pattern. Sometimes, like the female in this image at the bottom, the spot pattern can be almost non-existent. I've even come across spotted salamanders that have no spots. So it's highly variable and a lot of fun to kind of explore what you can find and what that means. They sometimes have strange coloration. This is a leucistic individual, not albino, but just got a strange pigment pattern. They are capable of limb regeneration, which is quite remarkable. And this goes into adulthood, not just the larvae. This is a photo series a friend of mine took of this individual who was sharing a tank with a predator and got his front right leg nipped off at some point around July 7th. By July 13th, the same individual was starting to rebud that front limb that got lost. And then by July 26th, it was entirely regenerated. And there's a lot of interest in this capability in looking at whether or not there are some applications for human medicine. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff yet to be learned. We don't understand this at all. This individual, if you notice the front left leg, actually has 2 feet sprouting out of the front leg. It probably was injured at some point in its adult life, and during the process of regeneration had a little oopsie and wound up generating 2 feet. So, you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in vernal pools that we can, if we just start looking and really paying attention, we start seeing some strange things. Our other obligate amphibian, the wood frog, is again a very common frog. It's one of the first sort of audible sounds of spring around much of the Northeast. Shortly after that first breeding event, when these guys do come out, they breed explosively. All of the population will come out in a very short period of time. And if it's a large population, it can be hundreds or even thousands of frogs. They make a loud kind of quacking noise. People sort of equate it to quacking ducks. And they start calling very early in the springtime. You know, shortly after you get that nice rain that brings all these guys out, if you walk around the woods on a bright sunny day, you'll quite often hear wood frogs quacking away. It's a good way to find places that you might explore. The breeding process produces an egg mass. Each female produces an egg mass. This is 100 to 150 individual eggs. I'm holding up two egg masses just poking out of the water surface here, and you can see how lumpy they are. And that's one of the things that distinguishes them from the spotted salamander egg masses. And one of the things that, as you become skilled in looking at these things, you can distinguish these eggs very, very easily. And wood frogs are going to be the only thing depositing a softball-sized frog egg mass in the early spring. These hatch out within just about 3 weeks, so there's a short window of time to go out and look for these things. Throw this in just to show you a spotted salamander egg mass again, just to see the distinction between this is more smooth, whereas the wood frog is quite lumpy. After about 3 weeks, again, depending on conditions, wood frogs begin to hatch out and turn into little pollywogs that hopefully everyone has had a chance to go out and catch. This is one of my earliest memories, is coming home with a red plastic bucket full of pollywogs from a marsh across the way. I'm sure they were American toads, but nonetheless, it's a great way to get kids engaged in amphibians and science generally. After a month or so, they start looking quite frog-like. This guy is got all 4 legs. His tail is beginning to change. He's probably beginning to gulp air at the surface of the water as his internal gills begin to change to lungs, and he becomes, you know, almost ready to hop off and be a frog. And hopefully that happens before this happens. And this is, again, this is the risk that these animals are taking. They're using habitats they, on a certain level, know are going to dry out. They're free of fish. That's a real important characteristic of vernal pools, but they're dangerous places. And a lot of times we have sort of complete loss of a clutch of animals for a given year. If it's a particularly droughty year, maybe we started off kind of low in the water and didn't get a lot of rain in the spring, it can have the effect of killing everything. And that's just sort of a calculated risk, and it's something that goes with the territory. As we experience climate change, this is one of the places we imagine we could start seeing some more important ramifications if the patterns of precipitation change dramatically over time. That could really affect the ecology of vernal pool ecosystems. So we'll have to kind of wait and see what happens there. But when they are successful, wood frogs can be produced in remarkable numbers. This is a photograph of a pool that is just days away from all these guys hiking off and turning into frogs and going out into the woods to be frogs. Vernal pools can turn out thousands upon thousands of little frogs that go off into the woods and begin a relatively short life. They live 2 to 3 years. But the real important thing with wood frogs, unfortunately for them, I guess, is that they feed lots and lots of stuff. And this is where the ecological value of vernal pools becomes really, really evident. You know, we are producing in a vernal pool maybe thousands upon thousands of toads and frogs and other things that hike off into the woods and get eaten by snakes, by birds, by mammals, by turtles, by other frogs. This is a place where an awful lot of biomass is produced that feeds the forest.
Matt, can I jump in with a question that's sort of related? What is the longevity of reproducing adults? How many drought years before a population might be wiped out?
Oh, yeah. Right. So with wood frogs, at least, you know, they live 2 to 3 years is about what we get out of them. They move around the landscape a lot. And so it's the sort of thing where we can have, as long as there's some connectivity between pools, we see rescue effect, where a population, if we had 4 or 5 years of real bad drought and a population of wood frogs was killed off completely, which happens, they're moving around the landscape a lot. And when things get back to normal, the pool might get recolonized. And that's a dynamic that happens regularly. It becomes a problem when we get into habitats that are highly fragmented. And when you hear people talking about conservation, and one of the real important considerations is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And that's what that gets at. You know, the ability for these animals to move across the landscape and recolonize habitats is important, really, really important. And when we fragment everything, break everything up into pockets that they can't move between, it starts having an effect. So wood frog populations are more tolerant in a sense. Spotted salamanders move across the landscape much less regularly. And so in a situation where a population of salamanders dies out for any reason, it's less likely to be recolonized. So one of the things that's really fascinating in my mind about vernal pools ecosystems is that all that biomass that I'm talking about comes from leaf litter. It all starts with the leaves that fall in the fall and get into the pool. They get broken down and shredded up by lots of little invertebrates primarily to start. And those big chunks of leaves get broken into smaller chunks of leaves, and those small chunks of leaves get colonized by fungus and bacteria, and those fungi and bacteria get grazed by the frogs, and those frogs grow and feed predators and other things. And so there's this really wonderful chain of energy that starts with leaf litter. This is an aquatic sow bug, an isopod, very common in vernal pools and all sorts of wetlands, very important creature at the base of the food chain. I'm going to run through a sort of whole bunch of different invertebrates that we find in vernal pools because I find them fascinating. I think I said that. This is a caddisfly larva. Caddisflies as adults are sort of moth-like animals, and they are aquatic as larvae. And so they start out as this worm-like creature that builds a case for itself out of leaves and other vegetative material that it finds in the pool. It chops them up with its mandibles. It has a silk like a spider that they use to stitch that together and create this case for themselves. Gives them some camouflage, some physical protection from predators, and also they can undulate the body inside the case to create a current of water to help increase their exposure to oxygen in what is a pretty oxygen-poor environment. Pretty neat critters. We have mollusks in vernal pools. These are fingernail clams in the center of this image and a spiral snail, planorbid snail. None of these is any bigger than your little pinky fingernail. These are really tiny things. In Massachusetts, we have 22 species of fingernail clam, oddly enough. So they're pretty common across the landscape. How they move around to these isolated wetlands is a bit of a mystery. There are some theories, but you can always ask your students to think about how these things move around the landscape. When the vernal pool dries up, which usually they will, all these things have to go away. And so that's another great question to explore with a group of students. What adaptations do all these different animals have to a vernal pool? The frogs, they metamorphose, they turn into terrestrial things and they run away. Caddisflies metamorphose and fly off as an adult. Some of the snails and fingernail clams will bury into the mud. Other things just die and leave behind a drought-resistant egg, what have you. Lots of different adaptations and approaches to dealing with these habitats. If you haven't had the pleasure of meeting a fairy shrimp in person, I highly recommend it. Fairy shrimp are just wonderful little creatures. These guys are about 1 inch long. They were in a jar in my kitchen. I brought them to work to show the engineers who didn't actually believe they existed. And so I've opened their eyes to the magic of a fairy shrimp. Really neat little creatures. They grow, there's a lot of different species. In the Northeast, we have a couple, possibly 3 species. They grow to about 1 inch, 1.5 inches in length. This photograph shows a male on the top and a female on the bottom. If you notice on the female, about the middle of the body, so on the left-hand side of the image is a head with a little brown eye spot. And on the right-hand side of the body is a forked whitish tail. In the center is a kind of a sac with a green blob and some yellow dots. Those yellow dots are the eggs that she's developing. So she's fertilized and broods those eggs in the brood pouch. And over the course of a few weeks or so, develops those eggs and begins to sprinkle them around the pool as she swims gracefully around. When the pool dries, and then we think it may need to freeze, we don't really know the mechanisms here, but when the water comes back the following year, that triggers the hatching of those eggs and they begin their development. They go through a number of stages and then become large adult and reproduce and start the whole cycle all over again. They are uniquely adapted to vernal pools. They don't survive in anything but. And it's just a really remarkable lifestyle that is unique to this kind of habitat. There are all sorts of creatures that we like to call wee beasties. All these tiny little invertebrate species that make vernal pools enormously rich biologically. These are a couple of pictures of clam shrimp. So these are very closely related to that fairy shrimp that I just showed you, but they've developed a carapace like a clam shell. Some of them are quite rare. There are Daphnia and copepods and ostracods and just thousands of species of these creatures that we know very little about. This spring, I had the remarkable experience of finding what I think is probably the most dense cloud of Daphnia and fairy shrimp and ostracods that I've ever experienced. It was still February when I collected this little sample of water. But this image is underwater in its vernal pool. It just, I've never seen so many all at once. It was remarkable. There are strange things like bright green flatworms, planaria. These really tiny little aquatic mites that have a remarkably complex life cycle, a portion of which is aquatic. We see hydra. So these are relatives of jellyfish, but they're sessile. They sort of just are attached to things. A similar close relative, but a colonial sessile cnidarian is this thing that's called the ghost moss animal. So these fine hairs are held out in the water and they just filter feed. They have a little stinging capacity. But when you step back and just look in the water, this is what they look like. It's really sort of unremarkable and a lot like moss. Just really neat stuff to find out there. Now, vernal pools, importantly, like I say, are free of fish, but they're not free of predators. And as the summer progresses, more and more predators begin to show up and breed and hunt in vernal pools. This is a dragonfly larva. It's one of the darners. It will get to be 3 inches or so in size and is quite a voracious predator. These guys are big enough to actually eat minnows, so they will be happy to catch salamanders and frog larvae as they develop. Predaceous diving beetles are very common in vernal pools and other wetland ecosystems. This guy is snacking on an unfortunate spring peeper tadpole. Giant water bugs. This is a photograph of a giant water bug which has stabbed and just about sucked dry a frog tadpole. Annie Dillard someone just shared a passage by Annie Dillard with me that I was unaware of, and she describes encountering a deflated frog and its giant water bug remarkably well. It was really great. Giant water bugs, the females will deposit the eggs on the back of the male, which is the one place in the pool she knows he's not going to be able to eat them. They are not necessarily a happy place. Here's for the squeamish among us, an enormous leech. This is one of the medicinal leeches back in the day. This is what you would be covered with to help alleviate your ailments. And if there's any poetic justice in the world, you'll notice just at the front end of it, which is near my middle finger here, this leech is being eaten by a leech. Gordian worms, very strange, non-segmented, enormous, complex life cycle, really cool stuff. So the biodiversity of vernal pools in the invertebrate portion is just out of this world. Just about every frog that we get in Massachusetts and sort of the Northeast will use vernal pools, but don't necessarily rely on them. This is a gray tree frog tadpole. That bright sort of brick red tail is indicative of those guys. Green frogs, bullfrogs, leopard frogs, pickerel frogs. These will all use vernal pools either for breeding, if conditions are right, or to go to hydrate and to feed. They'll use them as migratory stopovers. Vernal pools are very important for a bunch of different stages, different purposes in the lives of many animals, frogs included. Reptiles, some of these guys, this is the spotted turtle. These are highly dependent on vernal pools. In some circles, they are considered vernal pool obligate species. They are so highly dependent on vernal pools. Nerodia, the northern brown water snake, very common in vernal pools. I'm seeing a lot of them out now. And again, just to make the point, there's an awful lot of animals that feed in vernal pools and are highly reliant on the biomass that they produce. This is a fantastic photograph of a barred owl that has caught himself a frog. So what do vernal pools look like? This is actually a topic that is very open to debate, you know, in personal interpretation and opinion and so forth. I tend to take a pretty expansive view of what vernal pools are. This, in my mind, is the archetype. Small, completely isolated, entirely set within a forest. This will hold water for 2 months, but it's going to dry out come, you know, middle summer, definitely. This is what I think of as vernal pool in my mind. But they can be pretty large. This is a fairly big vernal pool that gets pretty deep, gets 3 feet deep or so. Will be loaded with buttonbush and winterberry and other shrub vegetation. Vernal pools can be pretty long-lived. So this is a pool that has all the ecological function that we've talked about, but holds water most years. It might dry out every 5 years or 7 years or so. In this case, it's fairly shallow, has a lot of green vegetation growing in it, which is sort of uncommon for a lot of vernal pools. So they can look like this. This is a really neat pool down on the coastal plain of Massachusetts. One of the things that's true of vernal pools is they have fairly regular hydrological cycles, the coming and going of water. And different plants have different preferences, and so they will set themselves up in rings with the deepest water portion of the pool holding plants that might have floating leaved vegetation like the big pond weeds and things like that. And then as we step away from the center where the water stays less and less time, different bands of vegetation can develop. And when we have flowering plants in a scenario like this, it can be quite beautiful at the right moment in the year. Now,
Matt,
all across, yes.
Can I jump in with one other question? There's a question, are vernal pools fed by groundwater?
Yeah, an awful lot are. An awful lot of Massachusetts pools are. You know, Maine pools I'm less intimately familiar with, but we share very similar geological processes. So I feel fairly confident saying that, yeah, most of your vernal pools are groundwater fed too. But I'd say the vast majority down our neck of the woods are. Pools that show up in red maple swamp are very common, and this is actually quite typical throughout much of Maine. We see them in the mountainous regions of Mass. This particular pool holds ice into June some years. It's so isolated, so protected from temperature change in the springtime. River floodplains quite often function as vernal pools. Even if they get flushed with fish every so often, those will dry out and kill the fish off, so these can function. This is actually one of a photo that was shared by one of you folks with me this year. It's a quarry. Not all vernal pools are natural. A lot of vernal pools are made by mistake, just the result of quarrying or down here the CCC back in the 30s did a lot of earthwork, sometimes just to beautify things. And they made a little backwater on this stream that the salamanders love. So it doesn't always look, exactly like you might expect, but they can be quite variable. So the one thing that I do like to point out is that vernal pools generally, with the exception of those that we kind of make either intentionally or not, vernal pools are very stable. The basins themselves, they don't go anywhere. The water comes and goes, and they may go through cycles where they don't fill up and or they stay full for a long time, but the basins themselves are very, very stable. This is a pool right by the house site that Henry Thoreau built his house at Walden Pond. And I'm sure that he would listen to frogs breeding in this pool back when he spent his couple of years there. And I enjoy going out there now and listening. Vernal pools are just a remarkable, wonderful way to engage kids. And I think you're finding that. Obviously, the photos you shared at the beginning of this presentation clearly show that Kriya's doing wonderful work in engaging kids in this. And vernal pools are just, as I hope you've seen, a really wonderful way to explore. Again, that early spring migration is a good opportunity. It can be a little bit dangerous, and it can be a little bit disheartening to see, the impact of roads on amphibian populations. But it's a great way to engage the community in this migration event and get people out looking for salamanders and frogs and helping them across roads and so forth. As long as we do it safely and hopefully with high-vis vests and all that good stuff. I had the good fortune of teaching high school biology for a short while, and throwing these kids into a pair of waders with a net in their hand, they'd never done anything like it. And I think you can see on their faces, it was remarkable. Remarkable experience for them. They were getting ready to head off to college and had never waded through a pool and found frogs and salamanders and things of that nature. So it's just a really great way to engage people in nature. So I threw this together. This is just a few things that are out there. I can share this so we don't have to leave this up on the screen, but Vernal Pool Association is a good resource. Maine Forestry has a nice website about vernal pools. Of Pools and People is a project out of UMaine and good to explore, Maine DEP. And then the Vernal Pool Listserv is just an open group of anyone that's interested in chatting about vernal pools. We have 500 or 600 people subscribed to the Vernal Pool Listserv. Anyone that's interested in vernal pools and chatting about them and sharing observations is welcome to join. So we'll share this information so you don't have to copy it down. But there we are. I think that I hope I didn't go too long. I didn't reset my clock, so I'm not sure where we stand.
No, that's fine. There are a couple of questions. One is, where can you find a vernal pool in Topsham?
Yeah.
From a 9-year-old.
Oh, great.
And actually, you probably wouldn't know the answer to that, but one place would be, we have actually one of those, CREA, the Cowdance River Education Alliance, at the preserve, there's a pool that we refer to as a vernal pool, although it doesn't generally dry out, but it has a lot of the things that you've talked about, and we actually do quite a bit of pond scooping, and it's right off of the trail. So if you visit the Cowdance River Nature Preserve, which is closed right now, but hopefully will open up in the not too distant future, that's one place. And and there's a vernal pool off of Pleasant Hill Road on Crystal Spring Farm in Brunswick, a fairly large one. It's if you're headed out of Brunswick towards Freeport, it's on the right. I'm trying to think of a landmark, but I can't. But you sort of can't miss it if you drive down Pleasant Hill Road and you see farm fields on your right, and then there's a patch of woods, and the vernal pool is in there before you go back into the back into the fields. A couple of other questions from in the chat box. When salamanders lay their eggs, do they leave them, or do they check in on them once a day, or not at all?
Yes, no, they leave them alone. So they deposit their eggs and they're done.
So no maternal or paternal instincts there.
None.
Another question, I'm just going to read this. We have a persistent pool on the Cowdance Preserve that once had a lot of open water, then was invaded by cattails, and now those cattails have died off, although I believe they're coming back. What does this tell us about what is to come? More cattails, gradual sedimentation. What is the life cycle of persistent pools?
So the arrival of cattails would probably indicate a change in the amount of water that the pool is experiencing, or the duration of the water, how long it stays. Usually plants respond to changes in environmental parameters. So they're not going to usually have an effect of causing change. Now, once they get there for whatever reason, they can change the dynamic of deposition of leaf litter, material and so forth. So once they're established, and that can begin to have sort of a feedback loop develop. But for the most part, something probably changed before they got there. And maybe that's just that, they might have been there and then, went through a period where they were not doing well and not obvious, and they, something changed and they came back, or, any number of explanations might be posited for what you're observing. In general, my opinion, and I think it's reasonable. Most vernal pools that I'm aware of are essentially do not go through a process of change, like marching from an open pond to a bog. Is the typical sort of process that a lot of people think of in terms of environmental change. Like it's on a conveyor belt, starting in an open body of water and resulting in a fen, essentially. Vernal pools don't do that. The cyclical drying really gives an opportunity for aerobic microbes to work on all that leaf litter and stuff and break it down, so that they don't build up real deep peat deposits and change dramatically over time. In fact, that glacial kettle that I showed at Thoreau's cabin site is very typical. It's like it dries out long enough for that leaf litter to get broken down, so that it doesn't ultimately fill in the basin. So that's a long-winded answer that doesn't really get at probably the observation, but obviously they're complicated systems.
Mm-hmm. It may just remain a mystery.
It may just remain a mystery.
Another question: do the spotted salamanders generate any internal metabolic heat? Does their activity vary with ambient temperature?
That's a great question. So yeah, their activity level definitely varies. Whether or not, so that's a good question that I don't know the answer to, whether cold-blooded amphibians create metabolic heat is something I'll have to look up.
Okay. And there's a comment in response to the 9-year-old looking for vernal pools in Topsham. It says there's one large wetland / pool on Forside Road, which is protected by Maine Fish and Wildlife. So take a drive out there. Do any animals eat salamander eggs? Oh
yeah, lots. Turtles love them. And I've seen newts, adult newts eating the embryos out of egg masses. I've quite often seen caddisflies burrowing into the mass to eat embryos. So an awful lot of things eat salamander eggs, frog eggs. They're very important. Like they're feeding a lot of things throughout their development cycle.
Oh, you know, that reminds me of, we had a picture, someone sent us a picture of a mass of eggs. I don't know if they were probably wood frog eggs with some large polywogs sort of burrowing into them. So were those polywogs, will they overwinter? Because they clearly weren't this season's, because this was
Right.
in early spring.
Yeah, bullfrogs will overwinter twice usually, and green frogs will overwinter once.
Oh, okay, that's
So
interesting.
if you're seeing frog tadpoles now, they're almost certainly one of those two species,
Okay.
and they'll eat just about anything. So getting onto a frog egg seems reasonable.
It was impossible to tell whether they were getting in there for cover or for or for food.
Probably
Um,
food. I guess they might be grazing on the algae in the egg mass,
mhm,
or possibly even embryos.
yeah. Another question. Well, or so a vernal pool typically dries out, but a bog or swamp does not. So the flora and fauna are different.
That's a reasonably true statement. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of variation, of course. And, making generalizations like that gets you into trouble. But yeah, but that's a reasonably good generalization.
And are axolots related to salamanders at all?
Yeah, axolotls are a, a larval salamander. It's the Mexicanum, Ambystoma mexicanum, Mexican salamander, I think. I don't know the common name, but they are. The word is going to escape me. Well, I forget the technical term, but they breed. They are capable of breeding in their larval form, so they don't metamorphose into an adult salamander and then go back and breed. They never leave the pool, and they stay in their larval form and become breeding adults. So it's a little weird, but yeah, they're very closely related to our spotted salamanders.
Someone thinks that's crazy. So I think that's it for the questions.
Great.
And thanks so much, Matt. This was fascinating. I'd love
Good.
to get some of your pictures of the invertebrates. And for the folks who are listening, we've recorded Matt's presentation, and we'll be posting it on our website. And a huge thank you to him for sharing his knowledge with us. And oh, I see some clapping hands going up. So, anyway, so thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us. And we may be sending around a short survey to get feedback on how this went. Oh, lots of claps.
Great. Well, thanks so much to everyone for checking in and being here tonight. This is great.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. So let's see. All right. I'm going to sign everybody out. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Matt. I'll be in touch.
Great. See ya.